on behalf of St. Antony's College to all those of you who are joining this seminar on vaccine diplomacy and the geopolitics of influence from all around the world. It's fantastic to have you joining us. As those of you who will know, the UK at the minute, things are looking better in relation to the coronavirus. The incident rate has dropped dramatically. The death rate has gone down. Lockdown is easing up. Things will change quite dramatically from next week, and restrictions are gradually being withdrawn. And at St. Antony's itself, the sun is out. Well, it was out a couple of minutes ago. Our building works are complete. And actually next week, we're going to have a series of 5 welcome dinners for all our new students just before they all actually finish their academic year. But that would be nice to be able to have dinners in hall for the first time. But of course, we're very well aware we're living in a bubble in the UK, and around the rest of the world, the situation is very, very different. And in fact, one of the strangest phenomena about this pandemic has been the fact that most countries seem to have been living in this bubble. And there seems to have been very little discussion about what's happening elsewhere and how different countries are dealing with this terrible situation. So today's event is roughly the equivalent of going to lunch at St. Antony's during normal times and finding out what is happening elsewhere. That's what St. Antony's does best. We have people who represent every region of the world, every country of the world. Our alumni come from 140 countries out of 169 countries across the world. We can find out as well as anybody what is happening. So that's what today's event is. And I want to say a big thank you to our fabulous panel of speakers who I know will be introduced in a minute. And just to turn over to our chair for today, who is Othon Anastasakis, who is the director of the Southeast European Studies Center at the college and who had the original idea for this topic. And thanks you, Othon, for having that idea. And then to Michael Willis, who is our Sub-Warden, who will coordinate the Q&A that will follow. So greetings on behalf of the college, and thank you so much for joining us. And over to you, Othon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. And it's a great pleasure from the warden, the sub-warden, Michael, and myself to welcome you all to our discussion today on vaccine geopolitics. And it's really, a global panel, this one, with the different perspectives from the different areas. And when we initially thought of this idea, which was a couple of months ago, it was the time when there was a friction between the UK and Europe over vaccine nationalism. There was also the vaccines coming from Russia and China competing with the West. So the environment was actually propitious for this kind of talk. Since then, a lot of things have happened, of course, and we are now into the big questions of what's going to happen to global security, global economy, global inequality. So we have asked a very broad, the same question to all the panelists today: how, from your regional perspective, your area is conducting vaccine diplomacy, and how this is affecting global geopolitical relations. So we are delighted to have our panelists today, who all of them have one common point, apart from the fact that they are all fabulous academics. They also have an Antonian background in their CV. And I'm not going to read the CVs because Julie Adams, who's somewhere behind the screen and is managing the platform, will be putting the CVs on the chat while our panelists are speaking. But I will simply give you the sequence of the speakers. And we decided to start from the West, the US hegemon on Antony Moore, Audrey Kurth Cronin, professor and director of the Center for Security, Innovation and New Technology at American University, will be speaking about the US and the Biden administration on this. We then move to Kalypso Nicolaidis, professor of international relations. Recently, she moved to Florence at the European University Institute as chair at the School of Transnational Governance, and she will speak us about the cacophony or polyphony. She decides how to put this. And Europe indeed has been criticized for vaccine nationalism. It is a little bit awkward term for the supranational Europe, but there you are. Then we move to Yasmina Abouzzohour, who is a fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations and the Brookings Doha Center, to tell us about North Africa and the Middle East and how this region in turmoil is actually experiencing this issue of vaccine diplomacies. After that, we move to the Eurasian power of Russia, one of the big actors in the field of vaccine geopolitics, with Roy Allison, Professor of Russian and Eurasian International Relations at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and Director of the Russian and Eurasian Center at St. Antony's. Then we move to China, no need for introduction here in terms of prominence in vaccine geopolitics, with Professor of Chinese Studies, Steve Tsang, and Professor of the SOAS, Director of the SOAS China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. We go to Japan, the country of the Olympics this year, with Neary, an emeritus fellow at the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies here at St. Antony's. And last but not least, Indrajit Roy, senior lecturer in global government at the University of York, to speak to us about India, the latest big casualty of the pandemic, and a representative example of a vaccine producer in the midst of a huge pandemic crisis in the country. I'm sure that you agree with me that this is a brilliant lineup, and we have asked the speakers to speak for 7 minutes, no more than this, please, because this will allow audience then to write their questions in the Q&A box only, please, because chat will be used from us for the CVs. And I chair the first part of the presentations, and then Michael will have the daunting task of actually choosing, fielding, selecting, collecting the questions for our speakers. So please use the Q&A. You can write your questions as soon as the speakers start. You can be anonymous, or you can just have your name as you wish. In the hope that I haven't left out any more announcements, I would like to ask Audrey now to begin this round of talks. Over to you, Audrey. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Over the past 16 months, the United States has gone from a pandemic denier to a public health provider. I see 3 major phases in American vaccine geopolitics. The Trump administration downplayed the pandemic from the outset, protecting stocks and the economy rather than people and public health. The United States began with a series of costly and mind-boggling decisions. President Trump's own pandemic task force leaders have admitted recently that the administration pressured them to revise scientific studies, delay announcements, and lie about testing availability. The president personally reassured Americans that there was nothing to worry about. With the exception of restricting some travel from China, travel warnings for Americans were delayed until well after other countries had begun closing borders and private airliners were already cutting flights. The administration focused on blaming China, calling the novel coronavirus the Wuhan virus or the China virus, and comparing COVID-19 to the flu. There was no national testing plan, and state governments were told to manage on their own. In May 2020, Trump surprised his own advisors by announcing that the US was quitting the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. The United States canceled plans to host the G7 summit in June and declined to join COVAX, the multinational effort to distribute vaccines worldwide. It was an appalling display of selfishness, unscientific statements, and irresponsible behavior that practically wrote China's propaganda narrative about US democratic dysfunction and caused even our closest allies to lose trust in American integrity and global leadership. That was phase 1. From there, in fall 2021, we entered a time of raging sickness in both our population and in our politics, on display for the entire world to watch. The surge of coronavirus infections was horrifying, with deaths peaking between November 2020 and February 2021. Thousands were dying every day. There were mobile mortuary trailers outside hospitals in places like Texas, Arizona, California, and Ohio, and the total number of deaths hit and then exceeded the 500,000 mark. On October 2nd, President Trump himself got COVID, apparently contracted at an indoor White House event. 4 days later, the White House was virtually empty because so many staffers had tested positive. One of them described it as, quote, chaotic. Throughout the fall, President Trump held large campaign rallies around the country, even as rates of infection skyrocketed nationwide. Dr. Deborah Birx of the Trump administration's pandemic task force recently said on CNN that beyond the initial surge of 100,000 American deaths, all the rest, almost 450,000 deaths at the time, all the rest could have been mitigated or decreased substantially, in her words, had the administration acted more aggressively. There was no focus on global pandemic mitigation. President Trump skipped the session on pandemic preparedness at the November G20 meeting. His attention was on re-election. However, a crucial initiative during this time was Operation Warp Speed, a public-private partnership that provided $18 billion for development of vaccines specifically designated for the US population. It was the largest of the global vaccine development efforts and successful in producing innovative, safe, and effective immunizations, including Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and numerous others, all at record speed. So vaccination of US health workers began in December. Overall, though, in phase 2, the United States dug itself into a bigger hole. The new Biden administration pursued aggressive vaccine nationalism at first. It had no realistic alternative. The United States was still in a dire health crisis. We had vaccines, but not enough. And we had serious logistical problems immunizing our large population, especially in our rural areas. Being a democracy, the United States did not have the tools to mobilize resources, control the narrative, surveil the population, and force everyone to obey draconian public health restrictions, as is possible in authoritarian countries. Still, the focus was not exclusively upon ourselves. On January 21st, his first day in office, President Biden joined COVAX. Taking the lead among donors, in February, the United States promised $4 billion. Private American foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have pledged more than $150 million. Today, the United States is by far the largest financial donor to COVAX. In March, the United States began working with allies in Japan, India, and Australia on a quad effort to produce and distribute COVID-19 vaccines throughout Asia. The US also exported 4 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine to neighboring Canada and Mexico. And last week, Catherine Tai, the US Trade Representative, announced that the United States would waive international patent protection on COVID-19 vaccines to get safe and effective vaccines to as many people in the world as possible. Intellectual property should not be an obstacle to protecting global health. After the FDA completes its safety review, 60 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine will go to the neediest countries abroad. President Biden has said that by July 4th, the United States will have sent other countries 10% of the total vaccines it has produced. Meanwhile, the US has dramatically increased assistance to India. On the 25th of April, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan promised an estimated $100 million in aid, including approving export of raw materials, funding expansion of manufacturing capability by Indian vaccine producer BioE, sending rapid diagnostic tests, therapeutic drugs, personal protective equipment, and a lot of other support. India had helped the United States early in our crisis, and the United States is now helping India. We are still in phase 3. Admittedly, the speed and scale of the American response still lags behind global demand and the urgency of saving lives. But the new Biden administration seems determined to, in the president's words, stay at it.
Thank you very much, Audrey. We will come back to the United States, and now we go straight to Kalypso on Europe. Kalypso, over to you. Kalypso, could you unmute yourself, please?
I did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Othon, and wonderful to be with all Antonians to speak about the biggest issue of the day, really. And indeed, as you said, Othon, to start with, acting externally in the world around the vaccine is not the same as vaccine diplomacy, which is a country using their jabs to enhance their own power and global status. And this is not a new story that a response to a pandemic is embedded in global politics, diplomatic wrangle. In the Cold War, the eradication of smallpox actually was partly fueled by the Cold War. And indeed, you could argue that therefore, and that's what the EU is trying to do. So, well, there can be some nice rivalry, cooperative rivalry. That's what Europeans are all about. But the problem I think we're confronted collectively, all of our regions, is that yes, there's always rivalry in the world, but can we have cooperative rivalry when today what we really see is much more divisive rivalry, blame games, spreading distrust. And I would argue that the EU, the jury's out which side the EU is on. On one hand, the EU is trying to, its vaccine diplomacy in a way is in line with the very good old idea that, you know, we organize cooperation between states in Europe, and we've done it with the vaccine, and we want to do it globally. So this is a moment when we're going to become leaders again in multilateralism, including on health and bringing health to WTO, a whole kind of narrative about that. And that's kind of the one of the core elements of the European vaccine diplomacy. But I'd like to argue that there's three, at least I want to give the example of three buts, three caveats to the European discourse on vaccine diplomacy and why the jury is still out. The first is this link between the internal and the external aspect of the EU. Audrey was talking about the US, what happened inside, vaccine policy inside. The first bit of your diplomacy is to show what you're doing inside and whether this is attractive and admirable for the rest of the world. And of course, here we all understand that the EU didn't do that well, especially at the beginning, for all the reasons that we saw with early response to the pandemic, but then of course the procurement fiasco, the very slow response to across Europe to the jab. But of course, what we've seen also is the fact that since then, the EU has stepped up, both in terms of distributing vaccine, in making the case that of the counterfactual, that if the EU hadn't done collective procurement, well, the small and more vulnerable states would have been left out. But also in stepping out in terms of solidarity and with the recovery fund, and stating that you see the EU is playing its role, creating a fund as never before, 750 billion euros raised collectively for the first time ever, leaning on the fact that for the first time in European public opinion, there is a sense that solidarity is warranted. We are no longer in the Euro crisis scenario where people internalize the fear of moral hazard. If we give money to the Greeks, they will misspend it, and they in fact don't deserve it in the first place, kind of thing. That CSOCs, Othon, we've talked so much about. Now this is something falling from the sky. It's not your fault if you get it. So for the first time, we are seeing Europe being able to engineer some sort of solidarity and financial solidarity. So this is the first point of the vaccine diplomacy, the idea that somehow Europe can show the world that it can cooperate internally vis-a-vis the vaccine. So maybe it has more credibility externally. Again, here the jury is still out. But then comes in the second point, and that's what we could call systems competition. What does the vaccine tell us about whether it's better to be an authoritarian regime or a democracy or a union of democracy? And colleagues from the other regional centers will have certainly much more to say. What Europe, so we're competing in the world, it's a beauty contest. Europe will argue right now that in fact it has a concern that is equal. It has already exported vaccines to 90 countries. In fact, it has authorized the exports of something like 120 million doses, as many doses as it has given internally. That's quite in contrast with what Audrey was saying with the US, where 10% of what it's given internally. So that will be the EU discourse, that it doesn't try to become, to be a strong man internally and to favor its own population. It is equally looking at all sides, but it's facing the authoritarian challenge, a sense, including in its own public opinion, that the Chinas of this world are better at it. And then, of course, having to deal with the fact that China seems to be proving it by or even Russia by helping some countries in the periphery, and we can come back to this. So that's one challenge. And of course, the other challenge is what we could call the hegemonic disruption that Audrey was just talking about, how actually the US, Biden has really put EU on the back foot with its call last week to lift intellectual property rights. And the EU has no response on this. It's trying to come up with a response, but this is going to be a very difficult thing because of there is no centralized capacity in the EU to decide no. We say no to big pharma, whatever Angela Merkel says. So that's an interesting and fascinating conversation. And where Europe comes out on this one will determine in part its credibility vis-a-vis the Indias and South Africas of this world. And the final point I want to make is, and the third point in terms of the buts, the caveats, is the UK challenge. Because of course that has been part of the EU vaccine diplomacy, making Brexiters very unhappy with this, the whole question of export control. I think here it's fair to say that it looked like the EU was losing a battle. The beauty contest with the UK was clear where it was falling. And it was actually a very good Brexit argument to say, well, if you're alone, you are more nimble, you can react quickly, you can give your vaccine strategy to a venture capitalist, et cetera, everything we know. We will see how this pans out in the longer term. But I think here it's fair to say that the EU's response to the UK discourse has been that, well, you know, we have exported many more vaccine produced in the EU than the UK, in fact, has exported almost none, that the UK is not transparent, and that it doesn't exercise solidarity with the other Europeans. But of course, the UK will oppose to this the contractual logic that, well, if the EU doesn't know how to do contracts, it's not our fault. So to conclude, I would say that the jury is still out as to where the European vaccine diplomacy will fall, and whether, you know, everything we're witnessing now will have a demonstration effect that, you know, the complexity of global health, the needs of billions who are excluded in the world from vaccine science and innovation demand a truly global response. Forget the rivalries. Whether the EU can step up there, you know, I am not sure, but if it will, it should do it in cooperation with all the other regions around the world. So I'm looking forward to hearing what our colleagues have to say.
Thank you very much, Kalypso, and finishing on this normative note. And without wanting to stop the flow, I would just like to say that I've noticed in the questions that some people have asked about Latin America or Africa. What I would like to say to this is that we had to put a stop to the panel because it was becoming very big and we really need to have a discussion on this. But if you've got points to raise on other regions as well, we make sure that Michael gives them a priority. So say that you've got, you know, on Latin America or Africa, and then Michael will make sure that you ask, that you put your comment on the extra region. And with this, let's go to Yasmina.
Hello.
Hello, Yasmina. We can listen. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Today I'll discuss the COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy experience in the Middle East and North Africa. First, I'm going to be setting the stage by examining why vaccine diplomacy in the MENA region is an important topic to discuss, before turning to how key international actors are using their excess stocks to compete for influence in the region. So as we know, a high number of vaccines has been developed and delivered since January this year. The problem for the MENA region in a time when COVID-19 is taking a massive human toll is that vaccine manufacturers are not able to fulfill orders and produce as many vaccines as they had hoped. This has slowed and sometimes stalled vaccination campaigns across the MENA region. While some developing MENA states were able to secure significant vaccine stocks early on, most notably Morocco, which had reached agreements with China's Sinopharm as early as August 2020, it is now mostly developed countries outside of the region that are in the lead. Just as a quick example, Canada has pre-purchased enough vaccines to cover 400% of its population, while the United States secured a striking 1 billion doses. And this has raised questions within and beyond the region about the moral duty of wealthier states vis-a-vis poorer ones, such as MENA countries with stability issues like Libya and Yemen. In light of this, many are wondering how wealthy states and manufacturers will allocate their excess stocks, and this is why we're talking about vaccine diplomacy in the MENA region. In this region, we must consider three experiences. First, the states that have struggled to secure stocks altogether or to implement vaccination campaigns. These include conflict-stricken countries such as Yemen, Syria, Libya, so on and so forth. Then we have those countries that have secured doses early on and that have already launched successful campaigns such as the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Israel. And this is the category which is, interestingly may dabble in regional vaccine diplomacy down the line. And finally, there is the category that falls in between these two, with countries that previously struggled to secure and administer doses, but that is on its way to catching up, such as in Algeria, Jordan, Tunisia, and so on. Now, the main international actors seeking to either increase or protect their influence in the MENA region through vaccine diplomacy are China, Russia, and the EU right now. Russia and China are treating vaccine diplomacy in the MENA region as a zero-sum game by trying to deter leaders from using Western vaccines through new vaccine travel rules and through public comments. Both have also used high-profile vaccine supply and licensing deals, for example, with Egypt and Morocco, to gain ground in the region. In short, they have made it clear that their vaccine supply to the MENA region has political as well as commercial goals. Russia, though it has less manufacturing capacity than China, has pledged 600 million doses to foreign countries, many of them in the MENA region, like Algeria, Egypt, and others. And it is worth noting that Russia has not yet controlled the outbreak within its own borders. On the other hand, China has managed to limit the outbreak domestically and has been instrumental in helping to launch some of the MENA region's most successful campaigns, such as in the UAE. Controversially, China has had rather extreme strings attached to its quote-unquote generosity and has adopted an aggressive approach to vaccine diplomacy in the region. Most notably, it now requires that people be vaccinated with the China-made vaccine before they can obtain visas to visit, which will have immense implications on China-MENA business and cooperation. This is problematic for the European Union, a major trade and security partner of many MENA countries, especially in North Africa, and the largest vaccine producer globally right now. Domestically, EU vaccination has been slower than anticipated, which impacts its diplomacy across the MENA region. The problem seems to be that stocks are limited because manufacturing has not been assigned to other countries. The fear within the EU is that due to these limitations, the door is now open for Russia and China to gain influence in the MENA region at the expense of traditional EU influence. And indeed, this is clearly a very real possibility right now. I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to discussing these points in greater details during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. And now over to Roy on Russia.
So, Russia's viewed its comparatively strong scientific and medical knowledge of virology, in particular, capacity to develop vaccines, I'd say, is something like a newfound resource. And in some respects, it's a way to counterbalance Russia's current relative financial economic weakness on the global stage. And a source of leverage, indeed, to raise its status and build relationships with quite a wide variety of mainly non-Western states. If we just cycle back to last summer, already at that stage, it was hoped in Moscow that the production of the vaccine would take place with financial partnerships and local manufacturing concerns in a whole range of countries, including India, South Korea, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Cuba. And if you consider these countries, it seems it was an effort to try and reach out to a set of middle powers who in recent years have become perhaps less sure of American guarantees and support. So I would view that as the goal there to encourage such states to try and think again about American efforts to isolate or contain Russia. You could even say that Russia was seeking to some kind of leadership role for a middle group of nations who are wishing to avoid the binary choice between Moscow and Beijing. And that in turn being part of Putin's wider wish to retain a global leadership role for himself. By February this year, Russia had secured production sites for its Sputnik V vaccine, I'll call it Sputnik from now on, in India, South Korea, Brazil, Kazakhstan. Serbia showed interest in setting up a site. Russia had an action plan for a site in Iran. Egypt seemed on track to become a hub for production in Africa, just as Brazil could be for Latin America. And all of this was helped by the Lancet Medical Journal assessment of Sputnik 5V as safe and effective. Now, this outsourcing production sites should be a way, perhaps it could be a way to compensate for Russia's relative weakness in production domestically. Really quite a weak domestic production capacity. But for all the hype, there have been real questions about how soon the Sputnik production network will really be able to meet global demand from the more than 55 countries now that have licensed it for use. In fact, mass production in Brazil and India hasn't really got going. Russia has deals to supply about 700 million doses of the vaccine overseas, but realistically, specialists looking at this suggest that a total production of perhaps only 380 million vaccines will be possible in 2021, if that. And of course, that's only really a dent in global vaccine demand. And in fact, Russia's began quietly to import some of its own vaccine from India and South Korea, from those production sites. And this positions Russia, you could say, lower in the pecking order of vaccine geopolitics as an importer rather than just an exporter. On the other hand, Russian officials have been very much emphasizing exports. If you go to the Sputnik website, it declares a vaccine for all humankind. This is how it describes it. And state media has lavished attention on even small shipments of tens or hundreds of thousands of doses to foreign countries such as Argentina, Hungary, Bolivia, Algeria, Paraguay. And a lot has been made of offering vaccine doses to Latin American countries hard hit by the pandemic before America has been able to do that. By this spring, Russian vaccine diplomacy, to me, seemed to have several broad strands. Firstly, to help post-Soviet allies such as Belarus and Armenia. That was a fairly small part of it. Secondly, to reinforce partnerships further afield, such as with Venezuela, Syria, Iran, Serbia. But third, and this is really where the vaccine diplomacy comes in, geopolitics, to exert diplomatic influence within traditionally Western-leaning states, such as the UAE, Mexico, Hungary, or the Czech Republic, all of whom are investing in Sputnik. In fact, the Russian Direct Investment Fund that's putting up money behind this has reportedly agreed on production of Sputnik with several major European Union states. And it's been helped by the way that Sputnik is developed, distributed and marketed as a national product, while their foreign competitors do it on a private corporate level. But as I alluded to beforehand, there's a sharp contrast, a glaring contrast really, with a weak focus on the domestic vaccination program. By March this year, Russia had vaccinated only 5 million people, or it's about 5 shots per 100 adults. Of course, it's not helped by the fact that the population itself is among the world's most vaccine skeptical. You could say there's also quite a deep-rooted cultural preference for foreign-made medicine, so it's an uphill struggle anyway, but the emphasis on the domestic vaccination program just still seems to be rather weak. I mean, overall, Russia seems to be presenting itself as a vaccine superpower in a multipolar world. This is the kind of the official narrative that we hear. And that narrative's gone with Russian efforts, including, if you look at them, actually some quite direct statements by President Putin to undermine public trust in both the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccines. I mean, Sputnik's, these are of course the main competitors. Perhaps Russia might also wish to steal a march on China in this new power play, and this is an interesting area of uncertainty. But it's been rather cautious on the official level, not to criticise Chinese vaccines and to present them as part of a wider growth of Chinese-Russian global influence. To conclude on a more positive note, if you look at what the Russian Direct Investment Fund has actually been doing and thinking, it's been a bit less zero-sum in its thinking than all these kind of official and high-level statements. And of course, it's been aware of Russian domestic production problems. And it seems to be trying to leverage the Sputnik vaccine in more pragmatic ways. So, for example, it's interested in possible cooperation between Russia's Gamaleya Research Institute, where the Sputnik vaccine was developed in the first place, and AstraZeneca. The idea here is to explore the potential of vaccine combinations, particularly against new possible strains. And the Russian Direct Investment Fund is also exploring the option of working on a combined regimen of vaccines with the Chinese vaccine developers. So you could say that that shows much more positive sum thinking, and it's something like a ray of hope for a more multilateral approach in the long term to counter COVID variants, and of course also widen global access to the most easily transportable vaccines, compared to Pfizer, which will be a particular benefit for developing countries.
Thank you very much, Roy. And let's go to the other superpower. Steve, over to you.
Thank you. China and vaccine diplomacy, I think, has already been mentioned by colleagues. I don't think I want to explain why the Chinese are doing it so much as to ask the question, why not? From the perspective, why would China not devote its resources and run away with the vaccine diplomacy? It has the vaccines, they are readily available in China, the several of them. The COVID-19 is kind of being contained in China. There's no compelling reason why it has to focus on the domestic population immediately. It can afford to do so. And then we are talking about a country under the leadership of somebody who is very, very keen to make sure that China is accepted, embraced as a global superpower, that China is popularly respected and admired, that Chinese soft power is being taken seriously. Vaccine diplomacy provides a perfectly good way for them in that perspective to try to do so. I would perhaps add that China has an additional reasons for wanting to focus on vaccine diplomacy. I think Audrey talked about what the Trump administration did in terms of rhetoric about China. Whatever you think about what Trump said was right or wrong, defensible or not, it does have a certain effect. It caught people's imagination. China was not so long ago being remembered as the country that was responsible for bringing about the pandemic. So China wants to change the narrative. Successful vaccine diplomacy changes the narrative of talking about China as the source of the pandemic to talking about China as the solution to the pandemics. And why is China successful in its vaccine diplomacy? Well, I think Yasmina has talked about the problems for Chinese vaccine diplomacy in MENA. And I think everything she said is right. I would actually perhaps go even further than that and say that Chinese vaccine diplomacy should have a huge amount of limitations. The overwhelming majority of Chinese vaccines have not been proven, well, at least not scientifically proven. They have not been certified. Only one has been certified by the WHO up to this point, and they are the most expensive. And the export of Chinese diplomacy are divided between some of them, those that were being given as gifts to friends or would-be friends, and others were being sold at the commercial rate, at the highest price of all vaccines with unproven effectiveness. So one would have thought that that's really not putting them in such a strong position in being able to claim success with vaccine diplomacy. But let's face the reality. I mean, they are actually successful. Why? Well, I think they are successful because of what the rest of us are doing. I think it was Kalypso who mentioned the term beauty contest. And much as I always admire and love Kalypso, I think I wouldn't use the term beauty contest here. I'll be very, very naughty. I think in the world of the vaccine diplomacy, we are looking at an ugliness contest. And China managed to present itself as the less ugly one. I mean, if you cannot get hold of vaccines from your preferred choices, you cannot get Pfizer, you cannot get Moderna, you cannot even get AstraZeneca, but you can get Sinovac. What do? Yes, give me Sinovac, give me anything. Chinese vaccine, I don't care. It gives me, my government, a scope to tell my people I am giving them vaccines. Whether I have to pay for that later on, that this country cannot afford, problem for tomorrow. It's not today's problem. I think we have to understand and acknowledge why the Chinese are being successful, and their success has a lot to do with how we are ourselves behaving. Whether it is going to change the general global geopolitics of it, I suspect probably not. China may not be quite as successful as the Chinese government would like it to think, but whatever countries and people may have in terms of reservations about how cynical the Chinese are with the vaccine diplomacy, they are not going to look a lot worse than generally how they are looking at in most democracies at the moment, because of the kind of strategic competitions that have returned between China and the United States, and issues being raised in Europe and elsewhere over issues like human rights in Xinjiang or repressions in Hong Kong. All those are already causing for all kinds of problems. And I don't think the vaccine cynicism is going to make a huge impact one way or the other, either in boosting China's status or in substantially weakening it, but it is part of that equation. Finally, I just want to mention about, for China, what really is the potential downside. I think the big downside is probably if some of the Chinese vaccines in the end prove to be not very effective. I think if that proved to be the case. Now, at the moment, we don't know. We do not know how effective they really are in real-world situations. We have some indications from some countries, but we don't have a comprehensive picture. So we don't know. But it will give the countries and the people who receive Chinese vaccines a sense of security. If that proved to be a false sense of security, and people who have Chinese vaccines do not get the protections they were hoping to get, I think it is going to backfire quite badly on China. It also depends on how well the Chinese government are able to manage the Winter Olympics next year. If in the end, for all the bravado and all the vaccination efforts in China itself, they run into problems with the Winter Olympics because of the pandemic, it will also have very enormous negative effect on them. But it may not happen. Let's not forget what I think Napoleon once famously said: don't give me able generals, give me lucky ones. The Chinese government may just turn out to be very lucky, and those problems may simply not materialize. At the moment, we don't know. In the meantime, they are proactively managing their vaccine diplomacy remarkably successfully. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Othon.
Thank you very much, Steve. And just to boost your argument on the rising popularity with the region that we have been working at CSOX a lot, the example of Serbia actually shows exactly how popular China has become by giving vaccines amply to Serbia, and not just giving them to Serbia, but also it has allowed for Serbia to do its own spillover vaccine diplomacy to the regions of the Balkans. And from the Winter Olympics, let's go to the Summer Olympics. Ian, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk very briefly about the Olympics at the end. What I want to do really are those three things. First of all, to briefly survey the COVID situation in Japan now, then to talk about vaccines and vaccination in Japan, and then talk about Japan's vaccine diplomacy, which is rather different to the vaccine diplomacy that we've been talking about so far. So very briefly then, the situation in Japan now. Compared to many places, Europe, the Americas, Japan has not really experienced waves, but as one advisor to the Cabinet Office said yesterday, has experienced ripples. At the moment, Japan is in the middle of this fourth wave or ripple. New infections are running around 7,000 per day, deaths at around 100 per day. Worldwide, that's not a massive crisis, but it's causing problems. Within Japan, particularly in certain regions of Japan, Osaka cannot cope with the number of severely ill people that are coming into the hospital system. There is a fear that Japan is on the point of an explosive increase in new cases over the next few weeks. So where is Japan in terms of vaccinations? Well, vaccinations began in March, but as of this weekend, there were only 1% of the population who were fully vaccinated. Around 3.5% of the population had had one vaccination. The government is committed to vaccinating all the elderly population by the end of July. That was pushed back from an initial target of June, but even to do that, it will need to vaccinate between 800,000 and 1 million people per day for the next 8 to 10 weeks. And that is not possible now. Whether it becomes possible in the next couple of weeks, we'll have to wait and see. The vaccine that Japan is using comes from the EU. It's the Pfizer vaccine, and as of the end of April, there were 28 million doses imported from the EU, of which 24 million doses are sitting in freezers at the moment. Moderna and the AstraZeneca vaccine are not yet authorized, but they possibly will be on the 20th of May, next week. And once that happens, it may be possible for Japan to roll out a vaccination program rapidly. But at the moment, we can only say may be possible. There were adverts placed in major newspapers yesterday criticizing the government's rollout of the vaccination, which strangely is the first serious criticism of the vaccination program so far, even though it's failed to materialize despite 3 or 4 months' effort. So Moderna and AstraZeneca are authorized next week. All of Moderna is imported. AstraZeneca is being sort of manufactured in Japan. I don't really understand the process, but if we think of this as cordial-based orange juice, then the concentrate is coming in from Europe, and it's being watered down in Japan and put in the vials. There are said to be maybe 20 million doses ready to go within these facilities in Japan. There is no domestic Japanese vaccine available at the moment. Possibly Shionogi will launch one, will have one authorized by the end of the year, but that's only 10 million doses. The Osaka University vaccine may be authorized by the beginning of 2022, but that's unlikely. So in terms of vaccine diplomacy, Japan is dependent on the rest of the world. Japan is a recipient. Japan is not a major player. Japan is unlikely to be in a position to give vaccines to anyone until the end of the year, at the earliest. But it is perhaps worth making a note about what Japan's vaccine diplomacy consists of. And that is its involvement within the COVAX AMC framework. Japan has been a member of the Gavi system, the what's it called, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, since it was founded in 2011. So it's almost a founding member of that. In the summer and autumn of last year, Japan promised $300 million and then gave $130 million to the COVAX scheme as part of its overall support for the program to extend universal healthcare to the entire world. And they've been particularly active in Southeast Asia in places like Vietnam. It was announced yesterday that the next meeting of the of Gavi will take place in Tokyo on the 12th of June, and it will be attended by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, obviously, the outcome of that is unclear, but this is what the Japanese will project as being their contribution to COVID diplomacy involvement within this multilateral framework. So, in conclusion, Japan has been a marginal or passive actor in the vaccine diplomacy systems so far, reliant on imports from the United States to Japan, and will continue to be set to do so. No domestic monogen vaccine until at least the end of the year, although Japan may have spare vaccines that it's imported or made from vaccines that come from elsewhere by the end of the year, maybe as many as 250 million doses at that point, but that's all conjecture at the moment. There's no likelihood that it will use Chinese or Russian origin vaccines, no possibility at all, and it will continue to contribute to this international COVAX process, mainly through cash. Just one final point, you're asking, what about the Olympics? It's difficult to say at the moment. I don't think we can be sure that the Olympics will go ahead. I think if the Olympics do go ahead, the most likely scenario is the Olympics going ahead with no spectators at all, not even domestic spectators. That's what seems most likely at the moment. But there is opposition within Japan to having any Olympics at all, fearful that the athletes, fearful of what the athletes will bring with them, and not just the athletes, but all the media that will accompany the athletes, and how you can corral all the athletes and the accompanying media people within the Olympic bubble. It seems to be almost impossible. So at the moment, I think Olympics will go ahead, but in extremely constrained circumstances.
Thank you very much, Ian. And last but not least, Indrajit, over to you on India, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Othon. It's great to be part of this event and to be in such distinguished company. When I was first invited to be part of this webinar, I thought I would be able to talk on the rather happy topic of how India's vaccine diplomacy was saving the world from the COVID catastrophe. At that point, this was end of March, I think, India was 2 months into its vaccine diplomacy, or vaccine friendship, as it was then called. Prime Minister Modi was gloating about how India had defied predictions of a catastrophe. Not only had India defied predictions of doom, Modi said, but it had also saved humanity as it was exporting vaccines for use across the world. The Serum Institute of India had obtained a license from Oxford AstraZeneca and was committed to producing 1 billion doses, mostly for lower and middle income countries. The SII is a private company that was selected by the Indian government to produce the vaccine. By the end of March, a total of 66 million doses had been exported. Almost 20 million were directed to the COVAX facility. 10 million had gone as grants, mostly to India's South Asian neighbors, and 35 million had been commercial exports, and we can talk about their destinations if you like later. By contrast, only 60 million doses had been administered within the country. So 66 million doses exported, 60 million doses administered within the country. That was end of March. After that, through April, the number of cases and deaths in the country began steadily increasing. India had started recording over 60,000 new cases and over 500 deaths daily. And the situation turned catastrophic towards the end of April. India banned the export of vaccine and then began an aggressive, if very belated, drive to vaccinate its own people. And even as we speak, I think the numbers are about 175 million doses being administered till date. However, death rates and new caseloads have continued to mount. It seems we have over 300,000 cases each day and approximately 4,000 new deaths daily. And those of you who are following the news know these are undercounted by a factor of 6 to 10. So the real number of deaths is likely to be at least 6 times higher. By August 1st, Lancet predicts 1 million Indians are likely to have succumbed to COVID. For the first time in about 2 decades, India was compelled to accept aid from other countries. Now, how did India justify its vaccine diplomacy, even at a time of such grave peril? So India's leadership sought to capitalize on the country's status as the pharmacy of the world, a status it has come to earn over the last few decades. India saw the crisis as an opportunity to cement its emergence as a rising power, and Prime Minister Modi referred to how India was on its way to becoming Vishwaguru, the teacher of the world. India's rush to produce and export vaccines was, of course, an attempt to outdo China's pandemic diplomacy, about which we heard, especially in its South Asian neighborhood, as well as among other developing countries. Now, criticism that India should have prioritized its own citizens rather than undertaking vaccine diplomacy are, I think, are misplaced. India has international responsibilities as a rapidly growing economy, and due to long-standing notions of and practices of South-South cooperation. You could say, if I can borrow from one of the previous speakers, that India was trying to embark on a sort of vaccine solidarity. And India's reputation as the pharmacy of the world has grown out of crucial interventions that Indian companies have made during the HIV pandemic by supplying affordable antiretroviral medicines to African countries, while the major pharmaceutical producers had demanded excessively high prices for such medicines. So while India ought to have taken seriously its commitment to its own citizens, it was perhaps not wrong for the country to export vaccines. And you could also say that its vaccine diplomacy was a productive counterfoil to the vaccine nationalism you saw elsewhere in the world. You could even say that there was a move towards vaccine multipolarity. So yes, India should have planned to do both, undertake vaccine solidarity or friendship or diplomacy, whatever you want to call it, as well as properly estimate domestic demand. But what actually happened? Instead, complacency meant that India did not use the 1 year it had since the start of the pandemic to plan for this second wave. And we can talk about what India did in the first wave in detail, if you like. Markets, workplaces, schools were kept open for months. Transport was operating in full capacity. Weddings, festivities, election rallies, everything was permitted. The Prime Minister himself and his entire team of ministers were out campaigning for various elections that were held across the country without any sort of face coverings or observing any kind of social distancing. The world's largest religious gathering was organized over several weeks. Over 3 million devotees each bathed in the sacred river Ganga over several days. We're talking about 3 million devotees bathing every single day. Mr. Modi himself was fashioning a Hindu ethnocracy at a time he should have been supporting states and his people with public health facilities, preparing for pharmaceuticals, oxygen, etc. India's media, by and large, remains subservient to the government, as citizens are now flocking to Twitter to seek help. People are dying because they do not have access to oxygen, something as basic as that. India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, bigger than Brazil, I might remind audiences here, has made it a criminal offense for citizens to complain. So finally, in terms of thinking about vaccine geopolitics, as India buckled, you have had some unexpected winners emerge in this, whether you call it beauty contest or ugly contest, whichever way you look at it. The gap opened up by India's inability to supply vaccines has been filled in by China, as was mentioned earlier. And the catastrophe has also brought to the forefront the issue of patents and contests over waiver of intellectual property rights. even the US government has, in the face of opposition by its own pharma industry, supported a waiver of intellectual property rights, even if this waiver is temporary. So anyway, I'll stop here and hand back to Othon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Indrajit, and all the speakers, because that's been a wonderful palette of different views. And before I hand over to Michael for the question and answer, one comment from me that I observed in almost all the presentations, this inconsistency and asymmetry. The success of the vaccine geopolitics doesn't have to do with the level of development or the superpower status. One time the countries can be at the bottom, and the next time they can be at the top of their game. So that's really, really interesting, I think, in terms of looking at this. But I'm very pleased, and I thank you. And I also thank you for having allowed us to record this, because we're going to stop the recording now to go to the question and answer. And Michael, over to you. Thank you very much.